All right, good afternoon and welcome to everyone watching. My name is Julian Morse. I'm the MLA for Frame Lake and chair of this standing committee. Today's meeting is public and live streamed on the Assembly's social media channels. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone, and particularly our presenter, just to wait for to be recognized before speaking. It just helps our audio-visual folks in the booth. And I will now move on to asking members to introduce themselves. So I'll start with Mr. Rogers.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Denny Rogers. I'm the MLA for Inuvik Boot Lake.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Kate Reed. I'm the MLA for Great Slave here in Yellowknife.
Thank you very much. And I believe we have a few members online. Yeah, I'll just start with online introductions, starting with Mr. Jericon.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Richard Jericon, MLA for Tunde Wildade. Masi.
And Mr. Hawkins?
Yeah, thank you very much. Just making sure you can hear me. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My name is Robert Hawkins. I'm the MLA for Yellowknife Centre. I am streaming online myself with the millions of subscribers to the NTPC Legislative Assembly eagerly following this presentation. My connection is cutting in and out, but I'll do my best. Cheers.
Okay, thank you. For what it's worth, Mr. Hawkins, we can hear you very clearly. So this afternoon, as part of its study of the Northwest Territories Power Corporation's governance structure, the Standing Committee on Government Operations is pleased to welcome Dr. Christina Hoicka, Canada Research Chair in Urban Planning for Climate Change and Associate Professor in Geography and Civil Engineering at the University of Victoria. So thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Hoicka. Please go ahead with your presentation, and then we will open the floor to questions from MLAs afterwards. So if you just want to go through the presentation, we'll do rounds of questioning after that. So thank you very much for presenting, and go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to speak. I just want to make sure, are you able to see my screen that I'm sharing with a presentation slide on it?
Yes, we can.
And you can hear me clearly as well?
You are loud and clear, 5x5.
Okay, fantastic. That's really great. Okay. Sorry, I just need to do a little bit of screen adjustment here. One sec. Okay, and you're able to see me again now. Okay, fantastic. Let me know if there's any lack of clarity. I'm calling in from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples at the University of Victoria. I'm sitting here in my office. And so I'm very pleased to be presenting over Zoom. I want to preface my presentation by saying I'm very glad to have been invited to present and to share the knowledge that's being generated from my research lab and the research that we're doing as a team. I also want to preface that I've never been to the Northwest Territories. I've never visited a community. I don't know what it's like to be there or live there. So I can only offer information from a removed place, but I still I'm hoping it will be helpful. And please do ask me any questions of clarification. I'm happy to answer them. So today I'll be talking about transformative electricity sector change and social justice. Okay, so I just want to start by sharing that I work with a fairly large research team. This is about half of my research lab, and these are the researchers who have contributed to the research that I'll be presenting and discussing today. So I'd like to talk about something called place-based approaches to electricity sector change. Then I will talk a lot at a very high level about knowledge and knowledge gaps to scale independent power production, – social acceptance, and the community energy sector. I will also talk about intermediaries and their role as pathways to change. And then finally, I will outline opportunities for electricity sector transformation that I see as potentially relevant for this study. Okay, so I'm going to get a little bit into theory here, but I think that you'll understand why I'm talking about this. In geography, we talk about something being place-based because it's a meaningful location. And it's the setting where we live our lives, we have social relationships, we have economic relationships, we have something called place attachment. And so my lab, we're really interested in place-based strategies to energy transitions. And that means taking into account local assets, actors, space, labor, localized knowledge, and addressing localized justice issues. And when we talk about place-based at scale approaches to renewable energy landscapes, we're talking about creating local value, incorporating multifunctionality and decentralization, and mitigating harm for ecosystems and addressing justice and local resilience. And so we recently wrote a paper about this in the link where we talked about how does this really translate into kickstarting a renewable energy sector. So I'm going to move away from the theory and just say what I mean by place is a meaningful location. And I made this slide that I've presented at a few different places, From this slide, I think you can tell where the place is because you know what kind of food it is. And so, for example, the pizza on the bottom left is in Naples, Italy. The sausage and mayonnaise and French fries on the right are from Germany. That was in Berlin. And then the other two photos, one is northeastern Brazil and the other one is Bogota, Colombia, where you can see lots of colorful fruits. So I've been watching some of the presentations and discussions that were had already. And I think the first place that I want to start with is that there's this really big transition happening globally, and it's happening in almost every jurisdiction. And the transition is going from this image in the top, where it's been a fairly linear approach to electricity production and distribution. It just goes from one end to another. It's been fairly centralized and dominated by utilities. But what's happened recently is that we've been having more and more decentralization of, with small electricity technology like renewables. And this is bringing about what we call the opportunity for democratization of electricity generation and distribution, and the inclusion of new actors in this system who are, firms, small and medium enterprises, citizens, municipalities, local authorities, communities, Indigenous rights holders, and First Nations. And what we're transitioning towards is more what we see at the bottom. We've got mixes of supergrids that are generating renewable electricity in one region, bringing that renewable electricity long distances to another region. We have smart grids coming on, so these digitally enabled electricity infrastructure. We also have microgrids, which I think Northwest Territories knows a lot about, and they can be grid isolated from the main grid or not. And on microgrids, in, I would say, the newer version, we have distributed generation, we have bidirectionality of power, we have storage, we have electric vehicles, and we also have prosumers and local electricity demand. And this transition from top to bottom, it requires really big changes in regulatory structures, which I think you already know, to procure and provide electricity. And what's happening in most places is that there's a power struggle between incumbent utilities that are trying to adapt to this new context and these new electricity actors that are trying to engage in the sector. And oftentimes I find it's trying to find a common language is part of it, but also that we're talking about a lot of new things, which I'm going to outline. So if we invite communities and nations to lead electricity infrastructure projects, for example, these could be independent power producer projects, community trusts, partnerships, Indigenous economic development corporations, cooperatives. What this can do is it can kickstart private investment in electricity sector development, which can be quite helpful. And for communities and nations, it can also have the outcomes of things like economic development and revenue. You can have increased project acceptance. You can have capacity development, reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, socioeconomic regeneration, knowledge and skills development, social capital, access to affordable energy. In some of our research, we've learned that it really contributes to a sense of pride for the community. And we also know, but we don't know these, a lot of this is sometimes hypothetical, and we don't know that this is always the case across the board. But we do know that the ownership and governance structure impacts the socioeconomic impacts and benefits. And what I have in the far top right corner of the slide is the statement that the social acceptance of a project tends to be tied to control and transparency of decision making and local benefits of renewable energy. So if you go in and develop a project and then share with people that it's happening, that's called decide, announce, defend, and it's shown to increase resistance from communities and stakeholders and rights holders. But if you bring people along from the outset and let them have a stake in the project, then there tends to be more social acceptance. Okay, so now I want to talk about knowledge and knowledge gaps to scale independent power production and social acceptance and the community energy sector. So this is a paper that we just had published a few months ago. I'm giving the link, the DOI open access free to download link in case anybody wants to take a look at this. But what this paper is about is we pulled together a generic framework on what needs to be in place in order to have a thriving independent power producer, community energy, Indigenous nation energy-led sector. This work has been put together by Dr. Anna Burka, who is at the University of Massey in New Zealand, and it's a pyramid. And so the foundation of the pyramid is the market access for technology. But then the next piece of the pyramid on top of that is you'll need legal frameworks for mutual ownership. So for example, legal frameworks that allow for a community trust or for a cooperative and ownership of that renewable energy or that energy project. The next is that you'll need financial viability and access to financial support. So you need access to capital investment. So that's another piece of the layers you need. You also need regional resource planning and facilitation. And for that piece, what's really important we're finding is representation. So who is represented at the table for regional resource planning and facilitation, and what are they bringing forward to the conversation? There also needs to be capacity building, like training on how to actually carry these projects out, not only on the technological side, but also on how to develop and plan these projects from the outset, feasibility studies, that type of thing. But the last piece too is that you really need to be building a positive narrative. And what that means is that if you have a successful project, to be able to go out there and share and brag about it and give out information so that others can learn from you. And I'll come back to some of these ideas later. But this pyramid, I want to point out, has been, it's been validated through research of dozens to maybe 100 jurisdictions in a very deep and thorough literature review, that these are what's needed. And the way that, sorry, I'm having a computer thing. The way that these can play out is by having policy mix supports at every level. So you need policy and legislation, and then you also need other types of supports, such as financial support, networks, that kind of a thing. Okay, but I recently did a report for David Suzuki Foundation that is forthcoming. What I want to talk about is that one of the challenges that all sectors are coming up against when they're trying to transition an electricity sector and perhaps bring in more independent power producers or bring more people into the decision making or try to address things like you're trying to address, like rates, the availability of electricity and that kind of a thing, is that there's a lack of consistent documentation of the socioeconomic impacts and benefits that are felt by communities and by customers. And what I have discovered from my study is that when we think across Canada, we do not have tracking of renewable and clean electricity projects and infrastructures. So we don't really have a central database, a central source. We don't have a clear picture of what's happening. Within that, even when there is tracking, there's inconsistent categorizations, including categorizations of NAICS codes, also across the definition of community and other business models. And so that's quite challenging as well. That impedes the tracking of the associated benefits and impacts of projects for or on nations and communities. And this lack of data in whole really impedes analysis that's relevant to the creation of policy that is supportive of low carbon and clean electricity grids. So this is the context that your study is happening in. Our lab, I'll talk a little bit now about some of the research that we're doing. This is a research project that we're in the midst of, and the results are forthcoming, and I'll be very happy to share them when they are available. One of the things our lab thought about in terms of taking a place-based approach is that not every organization or community or utility, et cetera, is going to value or favor ownership of renewables or ownership of infrastructure or other types of models. And so what we did was we said, what's the broadest range of models of community governance involvement in electricity sector and energy sector activities? And so what we found is that there are three major clusters of models. One is dialogue. Dialogue models are about supporting the discussion, advisory capacities with varying levels of decision-making for communities involved in energy projects. Compensation models are things like impact and benefit agreements, resource revenue sharing agreements. They are defined legal rights to benefits for communities as results of energy project development. And then the last cluster is ownership, where communities can own energy infrastructure projects such as generation or transmission. And then within ownership, because we have so many stakeholders and rights holders and citizens and actors at the table, we've divided these into three more clusters. One cluster of models is that no one entity or person can have control, and there's 5 of those. One example would be a cooperative. At the other end, we have models where one entity or person can have control. And then in the middle, there are some models that allow for either. Sometimes there's control, sometimes there's not. So here's just a visual example of some of the different types of models that we've looked at. So for example, a limited partnership with Indigenous coalitions, Wate Power, equity ownership combined with a participatory community trust in Bow Lake Wind Facility, renewable energy cooperatives, community choice aggregation, and sustainable energy utilities. And here's just a nice visual of the sector actors who be involved in these types of models governance options that we found, where intermediaries and knowledge networks play a different kind of role that I'm going to get to. Another project that we've been doing is looking at place-based renewable energy projects, and we call them renewable energy clusters. And so on the left-hand side, this is from O'Neill et al. It's a great report that I provide the link to in my note. And you can see that they've sort of broadly divided into three landscapes, and I'm sure there's more than that. But they're trying to show the idea that the type of electricity development that you have in a rural area will be different than in an urban area, and maybe different than a coastal area. And in the right-hand figure, they are arguing that in order to have these place-based approaches, we need to take into account multifunctionality, natural capital, generating local value, decentralization, resilience to climate disruption, and what we call energy justice, which is recognizing how energy projects can negatively or impact or positively benefit different people. So on this project, where we're at now, again, unpublished results, is we've used what's called manual data-driven approaches, and we've identified 510 renewable energy clusters globally. And on the right-hand side is a not as artistic as I wish rendering of these clusters, but the idea is that we have different types of renewable energy sources, flexibility, and demand-side innovations in the cluster. By gathering this data set of 510 clusters, what we can learn about it is about who is involved, the characteristics of the clusters, the policy and regulatory factors that led to their emergence, and study how the technologies fit together. And we are trying to design this so that the data could offer useful guidance for decision-making in selecting, prioritizing, and financing clean innovation strategies, and taking into account sector-specific pathways and the distributional impacts of proposed low-carbon and or resilient recovery policies and programs. Here's another study that we just had published, and again, I've added the link for a free download. In this paper, we worked with a coalition of intermediaries, of organizations in British Columbia, and we reviewed their advocacy documents to create a First Nation Power Authority. And we also interviewed 14 nations. And this image is probably the most relevant finding for you, which is that we looked at these models of power authorities in terms of how conformative or transformative they were. A conformative model would be something that doesn't change the makeup or the structure of the sector. So in this case, BC Utilities Commission, BC Hydro, and the BC government would maintain full control over the electricity sector. On the transformative end, for this paper, we looked at First Nations having control over the electricity sector in their regions, awarded to them through the application of DRIPA, which is the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. And so we found 6 types of models. The most, what we would call conformative, is the capacity building point of contact. It's a model that exists in Canada, and I will talk about it in a little bit, but it's the idea of providing training and support in order to design a project and bring it from start to end, get the financing, all of those pieces. But another option is something called the put contract. And the put contract, an example of that would be to say, the electricity utility says, well, we need this many megawatts of renewable electricity, and we are going to give this many megawatts to a First Nation Power Authority to go out and contract and bring that electricity onto the grid. And First Nations have argued for this by saying that they can provide for the shortfall of electricity while also bringing in economic revenue into their communities and nations. The next model that's more transformative, because it really hasn't being done very much is the industrial interconnection model. And that, for example, is Wate Power, which is 51% owned by 24 First Nations, 49% owned by private interests led by Fortis. It's 1,800 kilometers. It's built across the north of Ontario. And so this is, this is now happening in British Columbia, discussions around this type of a model. The next type is local or regional golden ticket opportunities. And, to go back to the industrial interconnection model, one more thing that I think is really important to note is that it connected 17 previously remote communities to the grid. That was one of the benefits that came along. Then there's also local or regional, what they call golden ticket opportunities. And a golden ticket opportunity could be any of these things alongside potentially, say, a retailer agreement. And so the golden ticket would be figuring out what is the next thing that needs to happen and providing that opportunity to the First Nation Power Authority and letting the First Nation Power Authority arrange how that happens. The retailer or wheeling agreement would give the right to nations, sort of like Bullfrog Power in Ontario is a retailer. So electricity customers can say, okay, I'd like to buy electricity from this retailer. That retailer is the First Nations Power Authority. They contract renewable electricity projects. And then those renewable electricity projects are allowed to happen even if they're in different parts of the grid. And then the last one is a regional vertically integrated power authority, which would be a power authority that does generation, transmission, and customer service. And that is seen as the most transformative. How would this all happen? So one of the researchers in the lab, Adam Regier, made table 3. You cannot read table 3 on my slide, but if you download the paper and you're interested in this, I highly recommend focusing on table 3. And in table 3, we outline the details of each power authority and the regulatory change that's required for that. So in the left-hand column, we went through the characteristics and the description of the First Nation Power Authority model. In the middle paragraph, we gave examples and whether it's hypothetical or real world, because, for example, the capacity building point of contract, the put contract, and the industrial interconnection models all exist in the real world. And then the last one column, we outline the minimum. I say minimum because there could be a lot of things outside of electricity that are required, but the minimum specific regulatory changes required to implement this type of First Nations Power Authority. And in the case of the most transformative one, that one would require minimum 7 regulatory changes, is what we found in our regulatory research for the paper. So with that said, those are different ways of thinking about tools in the toolkit to make change. Thinking about power authorities, thinking about different types of ownerships, thinking about different types of governance, thinking about the pyramid of policy instruments that need to be in place in order for this change to happen. So now I want to turn my attention to transformative change in an electricity sector. And intermediary organizations are organizations that seed wider change, and they're very important in transformation. So intermediaries are critical to electricity sector development and redevelopment. And intermediaries are not a specific type of organization, but they're defined by the functions that they perform. So for example, intermediaries can support the adoption and diffusion of technologies and innovations. They can also support the adoption and diffusion of social innovations, new governance arrangements, new business models that are new to a jurisdiction or a market. Intermediaries functions, they also create and maintain networks among communities, nations, developers, governments, regulators, suppliers, by playing the role of what's called a middle actor or a boundary spanner or a hybrid actor. So within that, some of their functions include brokering, policy entrepreneurship, networking, relationship building, legal and financial advising, translation, capacity building, training, community support, research advancement, communication and public relations, technological support, and knowledge mobilization. When we think about intermediaries specific to community energy or community involvement in change, these types of intermediaries can support institutional, infrastructural, and participatory elements. So they can help, for example, aggregate communities and learning. They can help establish institutional infrastructure. They can help with framing and coordinating local project activities. Oh, that was a double on there. Organizationally, there are many, many types of intermediaries. So they could be universities, they could be non-governmental organizations, they can be innovation networks, they can be partnerships, consultants, architects, standardization committees, among many others. So here's a snapshot of intermediaries in Canada who are, these ones are mainly intermediaries working around Indigenous Nation and First Nation involvement in the energy sector. We may have missed some, but what you can see is that there's quite a few. And some of these intermediaries, such as Pembina Institute, support policy and regulatory change. Indigenous Clean Energy has the Catalyst 2020 program. They do a lot of really important work around knowledge building, training. Yukon University has the Northern Energy Innovation, and they are an intermediary that supports conversations between utilities and communities. The CASES is also at the University of Saskatchewan, and they are a research project. So I won't go through all of them, but as you can see, there are quite a few, and they don't all play the same role in the sector. They tend to provide some overlapping, but also different types of services. So what are some of the opportunities to seed transformative change? And here I'm coming at this as a professor at a university, a researcher who is involved in research projects that relate around Yukon territory, in British Columbia, in Ontario, and also some nationwide projects. So I think it is really helpful to figure out the best options and the range of options by developing and finding intermediaries that can help with tailor-based approaches and networks that will connect communities to each other, to the region and utility, and the connections outside the region. Intermediaries are fundamentally nodes of a network. The more intermediaries you can get involved, and growing a network, I think, can really kickstart transformational change. Some examples of these, I took a look at Northwest Territory. So research projects and research institutes can provide some of the functions of an intermediary and advance innovation in technology, governance, and business models. So I see that there's Aurora College and Aurora Research Institute, which I know is already working on energy research. But for instance, there are fairly large grants out there. So New Frontiers and Research Fund has transformation grants for $24 million. And these bring together many researchers on projects, many of them surrounding communities and transformational change, and the idea of thinking about how do we integrate new technologies into a sector, and how can we do the economic modeling and address the social impact issues, participatory issues, There's NSERC Alliance Society grants. And then finally, the biggest grant in Canada that I'm aware of is the Canada First Excellence Research Fund, which usually runs from about 50 million to 125 million for an institution. And again, it tends to be across institutions and is just a larger version of the New Frontiers and Research Fund, where many different approaches and lenses and researchers and students and support can be brought to an issue. The last thing is something that I've been suggesting for the last little while since I wrote the report, which is I do think that we need to develop a national scale, federally funded, stakeholder and rights holder governed partnership for data sharing and analysis to track renewable and clean electricity projects and infrastructures, their governance structures, the associated impacts and benefits to allow for critical analysis and network development, because it's really hard to envision what you could do if you don't have access to information about what somebody else did, and even potentially reach out to them and find out would they do it the same way again or what's changed since that happened. I think that there needs to be a lot more information and attention brought to this and a more coordinated approach. I've now listing suggested reading. So this is strongly suggested reading. It's 44 recommendations for Indigenous people, nations, policymakers, and utilities. It's the National Indigenous Electrification Strategy, the strategy to accelerate Indigenous ownership of net zero infrastructure in Canada. The recommendations, because there's 44 of them, this is a very, very thorough report. And it addresses, I would say, all aspects of the pyramid that I've presented. And then here's a list of other suggested readings. Unfortunately, these are all academic. A couple of reports in here. I still think it's valuable reading for the types of questions that your committee and study are grappling with at this moment. That's it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. That was good. Can do any committee members have questions for the presenter? Denny, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for the presentation. It was certainly very interesting. I like the idea of the data sharing and tracking of renewable energy, although I'm not sure it would be, the results would be 100% would show favorably for the Arctic, certainly where I live. And I live in the Nunavik, which is obviously well above the Arctic Circle. And one of the things we struggle with up there is integrating renewable with non-renewable. Renewable itself, where I live, we can't solely rely upon that, of course, to heat our homes and power our homes. And I know, in speaking with residents up there, they're concerned about the effects of using non-renewables. I mean, the costs in the north are sometimes restrictive. And what's happened in the last few years is that there's been a significant amount of federal funding that, that entities, organizations can get, for solar or wind or other non-renewables, and are quite cost effective for the entities that are getting them. But what happens is, because that again draws revenue from the non-renewable distribution up there that's done through our power corporation, that revenue then has to be collected from the remainder of the ratepayers. So it's kind of difficult. I mean, I like the fact that, I've always been a proponent of looking at how we can work closer with Indigenous governments to look at maybe redirecting some of the transmission and the distribution of the power, whereas Indigenous governments can then potentially partner up with private sector companies that do provide power, outside of their respective governments. So I just didn't know if you had any thoughts on that. I know it's a little outside of the presentation, the thoughts on things that we could look at kind of in the Arctic where again, renewables at this point can't be the sole, what we can solely rely on to heat and power our homes up there. And and I know they're looking at, our power corporation are looking at some different technologies now to integrate that without causing that additional cost to the to the other ratepayers, because the cost of having the infrastructure there doesn't change the fixed costs. Thank you.
Thanks. Go ahead, Dr. Hoekstra, or Hoicka, sorry.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and I have been watching the presentations by other speakers and the question periods, and my presentation is really an overview of different ways to get at addressing these sticky issues that are, technologically, financially, policy, difficult in each situation. And each situation also is unique, in certain ways and to a certain extent. For example, one of the research projects that I'm working on, because renewables are not always available at different times, I see that for example, in Northwest Territories, sometimes the water is running low, for example, and so hydroelectric power is affected. And there's a lot of other really important details that are impacting the integration. And so this is where one suggestion is to work with these larger projects and invite, researchers and projects in. So one project that I'm on right now, one of the technologies that they're looking at is seasonal storage for electricity. And so, for example, if you can store electricity or heat seasonally, then you could store that up at a time of year when you have quite a bit of renewables available or other, fuels available, and then use that at another point in time. And so I work on research projects with quite a number of engineers and technological researchers. And so but also paired with people who are able to work on community engagement around social acceptance of these, and additionally with researchers who are, for example, experts. They can look at the economic modeling and the impact on rates. And so I think I personally or professionally don't have the skill set to solve that specific problem. And I understood that the very narrow piece that you're able to look at is around the rate base. And that is really critically important, and power prices are really critically important. But I think we also need to bring different principles and approaches to some of these, and think about the wider implications. For example, thinking about what's the social value of reliable electricity. What is it that what are the broader outcomes that we're hoping to accomplish, and what are the principles that can support that? I hope that somewhat answers your question, but that's the approach that I'm aiming for here, which is that I think that the issues that you're addressing are quite serious and appear to be different in different locations. And what we do know is that with electricity, having changes, for example, like the addition of many electric vehicles or something else, they can have really critical outcomes. One thing that I did not notice in some of the previous studies, and where it would be, I think, a holistic approach, is to very carefully consider demand reduction and efficiency approaches. I think that is an incredibly critical part of the mix. However, given that, we did learn from some of our interviews, for example, that for example, implementing heat pumps, which can really dramatically reduce electricity use, also can have impacts with the distribution grid. So if the distribution grid is not at the right specification or standards, then it can be difficult to implement heat pumps across a community. And then on top of that, if there's a power outage, that can affect heat. So we also have to take a systems approach to all of these aspects, because every solution that you have will interact with some other aspect of the system. I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers, do you have a follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for that. Yeah, and I appreciate it. You know, there's the social aspect, and there's the aspect of the cost of living in the north, which is extreme, not only for power but for other things.
Yeah.
And certainly, yeah, and we have looked at heat pumps up there as well, and it's not feasible. I live in an area where it's winter 9 months of the year, and power outages can be very catastrophic. So, but I certainly appreciate your insight into that. No further questions, Mr. Chair. Again, thank you for your presentation.
Okay, thank you. Further questions from committee? Anything further? Okay. I have a few. One thing I was wondering about is, I'm probably asking Mr. Rogers' question again in maybe a slightly different way, but I mean, the bottom line is that one of the biggest challenges we're facing here in the north, of course, is that we've got, our power utility, who faces the problem that they have to maintain all the same infrastructure up to a certain point, kind of regardless of what individual users are doing. And so what we have is, there's been a number of people who have been incentivized to put panels in and tie those into the grid. But what's really happening is people who can afford to do that are benefiting from cheaper power. And of course, the utility still has to maintain all the infrastructure using a smaller and smaller group of people who are contributing to the power. So what ends up happening is people who can't necessarily afford to buy a big fancy solar system and put it on their house are now in the position of their power rates going up. And so I know you mentioned social justice as part of your research. And so the unfortunate aspect of this is that, wealthy people effectively are benefiting from their ability to transition off of the grid, or at least transition a significant amount of power off the grid, and of course putting that onto the backs of people who can't afford that change. So how do we deal with this wicked problem of the fact that the utility does need to sustain itself in some way, and that the more we add to the system, the more expensive it becomes for them to provide power for a smaller and smaller group of people? Has your research touched upon that, or are we getting into I'm curious to know your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. In our research, we don't directly deal with that, but I perfectly understand. I understand what the issue is that you're raising. And again, I think it's a really highly complex. During my master's degree, I studied rate design for electricity. So this is incredibly familiar. I think that this is where the principled approach, that you need to take a few different approaches in my mind. So one approach is really, I think having, how I was talking about developing networks and building conversations. I think that what you're doing right now, and having more of that and having more conversations is going to be really critical to finding better pathways than what you have. And I'm a researcher, so that's going to be my base position, right? But I think that there's generating a lot of knowledge and discussion around what the problems are and what the potential solutions are, and bringing in the people who can do a lot of the work and who are aware of, I think, a lot of the cutting edge in terms of approaches and that kind of thing, whoever they might be. I think that that's going to be really helpful. But I think this is also this is not, to me, this is not just an economic or technological concern. It's about what do we value and what approaches are we going to take to what we value. So as an example, it is quite common for there to be electricity rates or supports or subsidies from other areas towards low-income people or low-income consumers or people who fall into a different type of area. And so there is the potential to, if it's an income issue, there's the potential to look at it from a principled approach and say, we should not be having increased instances of energy poverty, or the potential create that circumstance. I think the other piece of that is that deep retrofits of buildings and households and end uses are really critical to look at. Heat pumps are definitely one mechanical option that may or may not work, but again, bringing in experts to figure out what is a low carbon, low cost technology that could work. But the other piece is also, I used to study deep retrofits to housing. And I think that is a really important part, because when you have an inefficient home or appliance or that kind of a thing, it can use so much more energy than you realize. And so I think part of rates going up, the counterbalance is to improve the efficiency of the use for the service. And that, I think, I did not hear about energy efficiency and retrofitting or other forms of energy efficiency in the presentations that I saw. It is quite common for utilities to provide that and put that into the rate base. And at the federal level, I would recommend speaking to Efficiency Canada, that does quite a bit of work around energy poverty and working with lower income households to improve their efficiency in order to be able to afford rates. I think one piece of it is to bring in this principled approach around what are the outcomes that we really want for people, and then to bring those principles into policy. And I would say that if you're really concerned about the rate base and how different aspects are impacting the rates, modeling would be of the different scenarios and rates would be really important activity to undertake. And I think that the thing to keep in mind is that the electricity sector is rapidly changing everywhere. I think in the case, from what I understand in Northwest Territories, because you have standalone grids, like the two grids that are not connected to the North American grid, and also you have many remote communities, I think that it appears that the pressures are felt more easily and more amplified when there's changes. But there will continue to be these changes. People like solar electricity and the cost of wind, they have been dropping. They're now the cheapest electricity on the market. And so those will continue to be implemented. And same with electric vehicles. They're not cost competitive now, but people are going to be using those. I think the other thing to think about will be things like, how are your policies potentially inadvertently influencing people to put those solar panels on the roof in a way that they're not prosumers and selling back to the grid, or finding a way to do it in a way that it works with the grid rather than against the grid, and with the rates rather than against the rates. And so there, that I think would be also an important area to take a look at. And some of it might include going out and asking people why, and taking a look at which policies you have available for things like net metering, and other opportunities to put solar and to put their own renewable energy in place. I hope that answers your question, and I'm happy to respond to more questions.
It does answer my question, thank you. And I would note that, maybe perhaps encouragingly or discouragingly, I'm not sure, a lot of the stuff that you mentioned are things that are in place. I mean, we do already have a highly subsidized rate system as it is. I mean, the lower rate, the majority of ratepayers subsidize a small group of ratepayers whose rates would be enormous if it wasn't for that subsidization. So we've got big issues up here with the remote system and the national grid tied system. So there are people thinking about it, but it's certainly, but yeah, I mean, that is kind of the fundamental issue challenging our system, is that it costs a lot of money to maintain a grid system, and we haven't gotten anywhere close to the point where renewables could replace that. And so we've got this fundamental problem where we have to maintain it, and the more that we add to it, the more expensive it becomes for everybody that's in it. And it's just it's a strange problem. You'd think it would just get cheaper and cheaper as everyone produces their own power, but it doesn't. And it puts us in a real catch-22. I don't see any further questions from committee members. I will just put it out there for them if anyone else has a burning question. Of course, I'm sure Dr. Hoicka wouldn't mind hearing from members via email if people do have follow-up questions they want to get further into. Seeing none, with that, I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Hoicka, for taking the time to present to our committee. We certainly appreciate you taking the time out of your day to share your research and insights with us. Did you have any closing comments you wanted to share with committee?
I don't think so. I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak, and hopefully some of the comments I've made can be helpful to some of your decision making in this study. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Again, on behalf of committee, we appreciate you taking the time. And with that does conclude the public portion of this meeting. Committee members, if you don't mind sticking around, we'll do a quick debrief in camera. And thank you to everyone, as always, for tuning in, those of you who have. So with that, we'll conclude the public portion of this meeting. Thank you.